this new episode of Let's Okay. I'm super happy to be here with Alex Merced. Alex, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm very excited to be on the show today, and very excited to see where this conversation goes. I've been looking forward to having a chance to be on this show.
Well, likewise, I've been looking out for different posts in the data engineering field. You have a very interesting background and expertise in career, so I was really looking forward to this episode. For the people who might not know Let's Talk AI, first introduction, we deep dive with experts about data and AI, and you can see we approach different subjects for long-term content, 1 hour. So if you enjoy, feel free to give a review or share a comment. That would be very helpful to grow. Alex, welcome on the show. Like I said, maybe for the people
Thank you.
who might not know you, could you introduce yourself in a few sentences?
Sure. My name is Alex Merced. I'm a senior technical evangelist at Dremio. Basically, I spend most of my time just basically helping people get better acquainted and get hands-on with data lakehouse technologies. So, understanding what is a data lakehouse, the technologies around data lakehouses like Apache Iceberg, Apache Arrow, Nessie, Dremio, and then again helping people get hands-on with that.
Amazing. We'll be able to touch on all of that. Maybe follow up question. So, I would like to ask you your state of the art, and by that I mean, what are you currently super hyped or interested about? Um, Either in the open source community, in the lake house, all the open source projects. But I don't know, like what most interests you those days.
I get pretty excited about open standards and the idea of anything that kind of basically makes it easier to interop between everything. So projects I'm excited about. I'm always really excited about Apache Iceberg because it provides this open layer for basically any tool to talk to a singular data set. But within the Apache Iceberg project, there's a spec called the REST catalog. And basically the idea behind the REST catalog is that if any catalog basically implements this REST specification, then that any engine that knows how to talk to the REST catalog can talk to it, and any REST catalog can be talked to by any engine. So this makes it where you don't have to create a connector for every different catalog for every different engine, which really allows the Iceberg ecosystem to expand. So like recently, one of the catalogs that I follow very closely is Nessie has just recently announced that they're going to be adopting the REST catalog spec. So yeah, no, it's just a really interesting standard. I mean, other cool open standards that really I find exciting are things like some of the stuff like that Voltron's working on with like Ibis, and where you basically create like a universal data frame API, or Substrate trying to create like a universal way of communicating execution plans. These are really interesting ways that allow a lot of the tools to us to be able to use more tools within the same platform in a much easier way.
Awesome. It really seems to me that in the data engineering space, lakehouse space, the universal word comes back a lot in terms of when we're looking at state of the art. Like, how are we going to be able to unify all the solutions in like one easy, user friendly tool? Does that seem true to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's the what makes it difficult now is that basically there hasn't really sort of been a standard way to do so. So basically, everyone has a bunch of different platforms, a bunch of different ways that they're doing things that aren't necessarily built or intended to sort of work together. This is one of the things that really excites me, particularly about the Dremio platform, because the Dremio platform is a platform that has many different level layers on it, and one of those layers is a layer of data virtualization, being able to connect to databases, data lakes, and data warehouses all from one place that does help do a lot of the unification. Now, again, bottom line is that no matter how many connectors you have, you're never going to be able to connect to everything. So over time, there does still need to be sort of a sort of standard mode of operation. And I do think this is where the data lake house really plays into, in sort of making it the data lake house, sort of the place where you store the vast majority of your data. So basically, I think of it as like an 80-20 rule, where you really kind of want to work off 80% of your data in the data lake going forward. And this will definitely reduce a lot of those unification problems, because most of your data will be in a place that most tools can connect to in formats that they can speak in, reducing a lot of those frictions. Again, will it be perfect? No, but that's why you have the data virtualization features and like sources like Dremio that allow you to connect that other 20% of your data.
Awesome. I'll make some follow-up questions, I'm sure, further on. But coming back on your unique journey, could you share some key insights and milestones through your career? Because you've been moving around. So I think it could be super helpful to like have an overview of key lessons and key moments that you've been through.
Yeah, I've had a really weird life story. So, I mean, like the too long don't didn't read version of it is essentially like I was always really into technology. Even as a little kid, I was really into video games. Basically, when it comes to like programming, my first sort of exposures to it is one when my mom was going to college as a single mother. She would leave me and my brother in the computer lab, and I would play with like GeoCities, learning HTML, CSS. Then later on, I got really acquainted with like RPG Maker, and that got me really thinking like if statements, conditionals, really like programmatic type structures. I did eventually go like for computer science and started learning C++. But then midway through, I suddenly like got a real passion for guitar, so I ended up going in a completely different direction for a while. I eventually do circle back, but basically, I end up getting into like marketing and cultural studies. I eventually graduate and then find myself in New York City, and I end up in finance, and I actually end up training people in finance for about 10 years at a company called Greco Financial Training, where I was, not only just doing the training, but I was handling the marketing, handling the website, handling many hats. So after 10 years of doing that, I decided it was time for me to start making my way out of New York. And always found myself still learning programming, still sort of dabbling in technology. So I was like, why don't I just do that?
Mm.
So I become a software developer, and I work in software development for a few years. And then while I do that, I'm always been a content creator, whether I was in finance, a random foray of politics that I had, economics, and now software development. I always made a lot of content, a lot of videos, podcasts, stuff like that. So I then learned about this whole realm of like developer advocacy, where basically you get to do all the things that I love in one role. I get to write code, I get to play with technology and learn things, I get to educate people, and I get to sort of practice some of the marketing chops that I've developed over the years, in the sense of just kind of like learning how to connect with people and create compelling messages. So I was like, wait, that's all my favorite things in a job. So I started looking for a role there. And with my particular weird experience, where I've also there was a brief run where I ran a comic book store, so I had a lot of weird experience there. um I basically there was a decent amount of appetite for my particular sort of experience. So, but basically weighing through all the options and offers that I got, Dremio was the most compelling as far as like just having a product that I can believe in. Because if I want to um, basically be an advocate for something, I want to be for an advocate something that I can believe in, that I think is really cool and really interesting. So I ended up going with Dremio, and it's been a fun journey. Really kind of being able to embrace the technology around the data lakehouse space, Dremio's data lakehouse platform, and being able to just kind of scream at the rooftops how cool it is.
Amazing. Maybe following up on Dremio, can you share like the vision and mission of the company? And so I'm surely for all the data engineering listening to us right now, they will know Dremio. But like if you can do a brief introduction and like some cool things that you're able to see, maybe cool use cases, success story around Dremio, like whatever feels like um, interesting for you to share around
Yeah,
Dremio.
Yeah, Dremio is basically the first. What is Dremio? Dremio is a data lakehouse platform, and essentially, what does that mean? Is that it provides you services to make it easier, faster, to and actually even more affordable to execute a data lakehouse platform in three sort of areas. Unified analytics, so basically allows you to kind of combine all your data sources, create a semantic layer on top of all your data sources. Has a SQL query engine that's really fast. So basically, we actually at the recent Subsurface conference that we did announce a recent benchmark where we found ourselves to be about 70% faster than Snowflake on certain queries, and then 100% faster on Trino. And again, that can be all seen in that keynote. But basically, you have the SQL query engine that also has really cool acceleration features, which I'll probably get into later because that's a whole conversation in itself. I love our data reflections feature. And then third, lakehouse management, because data lakehouses are cool, but one of the problems with data lakehouses is that you don't get a lot of the benefits of data warehouses and databases, where it just kind of takes care of a lot of things behind the scenes, like data
Mhm.
optimization, whatnot. So Dremio provides that for your lakehouse, in the sense where it can automatically manage your tables, automatically do garbage cleanup, provides you sort of a Git like experience with your data catalog. So basically, it's all these sort of different pillars of services to make it easier to do the data lakehouse. Some interesting examples of people who've we're a lot. I mean, even before the data lakehouse space, Dremio was really popular for a lot of its data unification features and whatnot. So, and then it's data, specifically it's data acceleration. So a lot of customers really you enjoy Dremio, especially when it comes to accelerating their BI dashboards, because oftentimes what happens when you're making a BI dashboard, you move your data to the data warehouse, and then you find yourself in one of two sort of tracks. Either the analyst has to make an extract in their BI tool, but that only works within that particular BI tool, or the data engineer creates like a cube in their data warehouse. But then that cube creates a whole new namespace that the analyst now has to update their queries. They have to make sure they update that cube every once in a while. But while when you're using something like Dremio's Reflections, you just flip a switch, the original data source on the data lake now is accelerated. The data analyst doesn't have to do anything. The data engineer doesn't have to worry about updating it. It just basically gives you that same sort of performance benefit, and sometimes even more, in a much more sort of efficient way. So that's been a really popular use case for Dremio. Another thing, it's the Git for data catalog is becoming really popular. One example is especially with financial companies, because what happens with financial companies is they have to do a lot of stress testing for regulatory purposes. So every day they got to take their data, then they got to make a copy of it, then run all these scenarios of like worst case scenarios on it. So that's so making that copy of the data can be really intense. But with catalog versioning, they can just create a branch, create essentially a zero copy, because they're
Hmm.
not actually copying the data. They're just creating a branching chain of changes. They're able to make those changes, run those scenarios, and then drop that branch and clean up at the end of the day in a much easier, a lot less expensive kind of way. So that's become also a very popular use case. So those are pretty cool. But yeah, that's essentially like the idea with Dremio. Like bottom line is, if you have a data lake and you want to do more with your data lake, generally some pillar of Dremio's lakehouse propositions generally are going to be of value.
Awesome, amazing. Thanks for all the details. Um, it was the advocate part. Advocate. Hello. I'm super interested in Dremio. Sorry. I think my follow-up question is, and I will come back to acceleration of
Hmm.
queries, and also I would like to linger on the marketing side of your profile,
Hmm.
and maybe some insights regarding that too. But before that, so I would like to comment on the experience writing Apache Iceberg, so the definitive guide. Um, the thing that really impresses me with your profile is that you've not been all your career time in the field,
Hmm.
but you've acquired so much knowledge of different things, and that seems to be very valuable too. So maybe you could comment on the book first, on the project Apache Iceberg, and your view on it, and yeah, I think that could be a first place to start.
Got it. Okay, so I'll just kind of start sort of like how I got interested in Apache Iceberg. So part of my role here at Dremio is what happened was that Dremio definitely um, embraced Apache Iceberg pretty early on, and but so basically one of the mandates that I had was to sort of like help people learn more about Apache Iceberg and help people understand, because at that time still people didn't know what a table format was. What is this Apache Iceberg thing? Like, what is it doing for me? Like, is it another file format? Which it's not. It's so basically understanding the idea that like, no, we're not creating a new type of file format.
Hmm.
Parquet is working just fine.
Yeah.
But what happens when you have 1,000 Parquet files? Wouldn't it be nice if an engine like Dremio could easily identify, hey, I don't need to scan all 1,000 files. I really only need to scan 10 out of those 1,000 files. For that, you need metadata, and Apache Iceberg provides that sort of layer of metadata that allows many engines to communicate to the same data set, but also to do it in an efficient way. So basically, that first year on the job really was just like me, like learning everything I can about Apache Iceberg and getting really hands on with it, and really kind of learning the history of all that. Um, and then basically what eventually happened is I met someone who wrote a data mesh book. They did a presentation at one of our subsurface conferences, and that kind of kicked off the idea of like, hey, let's do an iceberg book. And then after talking to some of the publishers, like Pact, Manning, O'Reilly, we ended up going with O'Reilly. And that was quite of a journey. Okay, so basically, people who were involved were like me, Jason Hughes, Tomer Sharan, Dipankar Mazumdar, who's now at One House. We all worked on that project, and it was a quite an exciting journey. Writing a book was not something that was on my bucket list, but once it got going, it was actually really not a bad experience. Again, it was basically for us, Iceberg is what we've been doing and thinking about every day. So writing the book kind of came pretty easily. I mean, of course, there were certain like little parts we had to do a little extra research or do make sure you validate certain things, but for the most part, it wasn't bad at all. It ended up being a much more pleasant experience than I expected. And now, as far as like how being able to kind of learn things and learn things really fast, because like literally like just this weekend I had to learn Apache Druid, and what was the other thing that and then really getting deep with Kafka Connect this weekend, and both worked out very successfully. I created the content that I was aiming to create, but that really was something that kind of came out of just sort of like that long tail of everything that I've always done. So in the sense that like when I basically coming right out of college, I ended up in that financial job where I was training people. And in that job, I had to learn basically the whole industry pretty much overnight to become an instructor. Because what happened is originally I was training to be an instructor while I was helping with some of the marketing stuff. And then one day, some instructors decided to, end their employment at the company right before a class started. But I was teaching myself the content as we went along, so I was able to fill in at the drop of a hat. And then that led to my journey of becoming sort of like the main instructor. And basically, anytime a new license would come up in the financial industry, I would be the one who would kind of develop that curriculum, go learn about the new financial products. So I developed this sort of pattern very early on of being able to kind of go seek information, digest it, validate it, and sort of grok it pretty quickly. And same thing when I went back to software development years later, I did the same thing. And a lot of that helps me do that is creating content. So like actually a pattern that I do is like when I was learning different programming languages and different frameworks, what I would do is I would first do like a hands-on exercise and then what I would do is I would document it as a blog. Okay, so basically my first iteration was the blog, and then after I did the blog, I would do a video of me redoing that same project, and then that would one again reinforce what I just learned, and then just doing that repeatedly, and then doing that across several different frameworks and languages, um, basically allows a lot of the high level connective tissue to really rise. Because like for example, in front end development, if I'm doing like React, Svelte, Vue, and Angular, a lot of the ideas are the same. So then once I learn all four, what's sort of like just universal concepts becomes really clear, and what's sort of like framework specific becomes clear. It makes it a lot easier for me to think through those things. So same thing here. So like going when I'm learning about table formats, learning about not just Apache Iceberg but Delta Lake and Hoodie. When I'm learning about sort of like different other examples like different clouds, getting deep into AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud, and really kind of seeing all that stuff, helps me really quickly accelerate understanding the what's the high level universal concepts versus the platform specific pieces.
That's amazing. Yeah, thanks. I was about to ask you like some more details on your learning process, but you are quite clear, so I love it. Maybe I'll do some time optimization. I would like to come back on the marketing side because you've been for so long in the marketing. Just to give you some perspective, I've been sharing with different CMOs of companies between 50 and 200, trying to understand better how do they use data and AI in the field today. And it really seems to me that well, there are the key softwares. I mean, there are like Google Analytics and the SEO thing and the Instagram and Facebook, and you can run some ads. And it will really depend on each industry and the product they're pushing forward and how they connect with the sales team. But with your strong experience in marketing,
Mhm.
um, what's the place of the lake house and like data? I mean, I would say data and AI enabled teams, like marketing teams, that can use data lakes house for like specific use case that we can really find in pre-built products. Or do you have insights regarding that?
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to specifically, like, I guess there's two realms to look at it with AI in the data lakehouse. So there's one like AI features in the particular data lakehouse platform, and then there's how the data lakehouse platform can help build AI projects. So
Yeah,
I'll
yeah,
address the first one really quickly.
yeah. Okay, awesome.
Yeah. So like with Dremio, we have a couple AI features. In the future, there'll be more, but mainly like text SQL, things that just make it easier to use the platform using LLM models.
Yeah.
But also in the production of AI, where the data lakehouse becomes really useful, especially when you have a unified platform like Dremio that connects lots of different data sources,
Hmm.
is making it easier to deliver the data to be trained, because you're not necessarily having to move around the data as much or hunt around for the data as much. You have it in one place where it's governed, so a lot of the other complications of data, like of getting the data into your model, becomes a lot less. You're just now it's just like, okay, let me write the model, let me go train it, because I can just pull in all the data from Dremio through one single connection, regardless of where the data exists. And then also that data can be pre-modeled to exactly what your model needs ahead of time within the Dremio semantic layer, to just make it really easy to deliver. So one, I say it makes it quicker to deliver the data to your AI models, because there's less steps. You're not moving the data to the data lake, then the data warehouse. And then because platforms like specifically like Dremio that can unify different data sources, you're also doing a lot less data movement. So it reduces a lot of the frictions in getting the data to the data scientists to work with, which then allows you to produce one, be able to adjust those models. Because one thing I hear that happens is that you have a model, it's working, but you have an idea of how to make it better. The problem requires you to have access to data you don't have access to yet, and now you're waiting like 2 or 3 weeks for the data engineer to make sure that you have access to that data. A lot of those kind of frictions then get reduced, because it's much easier to deliver access to those new data with platforms like Dremio.
Mm. Yeah, thank you very much for those clarifications. And yeah, I was definitely referring to like you have a lake house, you have all the data in one place, and you're going to build custom models on top of it. Or, I mean, you can start from queries because a lot of times in marketing we talk about specific metrics, but there are different ways to measure those metrics. Even though like we can easily find formulas, but it really depends on the business context, and we need to take some further like more variables into account. And it really seems to me that so here are the things when like for example CMOs are trying to optimize those metrics to have a better return on investments, lower cost acquisition customers, like metrics that we see all the time. Do you have insights on like once data scientists or business analysts can plug to the lake house things or use cases that can be done that could not be done directly from investigating Google Analytics or using like specific CRMs with like AI enabled features? This is a very specific question, but I don't know if you have insights on that.
I mean, I would say like when you take a look at the data lake as a whole, the data lake is going to be able to store data that's structured or unstructured. So that co-locates a lot of data. So on one angle, you could use things like, I mean, one approach, like for example, the Dremio platform is more specifically for like structured and semi-structured data.
Hmm.
But again, the great thing about the data lakehouse is that it's structured in a way that you can use multiple tools. So you can use
Hmm.
other tools that are built for unstructured data. But also with the advent of like LLMs, you could use LLMs to help take unstructured data and make it structured. Basically, run a prompt against, hey, read all my emails and create this table
Hmm.
that fits a specific model, to for whether it's analytics or an AI ML model. So there's that angle too of just having all this data co-located makes it easier to pull in. Um, but again, I think the biggest benefit, as far as just the space in general, is going to be just the friction it takes out in getting the data. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily like where the data is physically located doesn't necessarily change like how the model has to be written and how what the features are going to be and things like that. But if you can get to that data easier and quicker, that's going to help. Especially like let's take for example, um, you know, there's marketplaces for data nowadays. You have like AWS's marketplace, you have Snowflake's marketplace, and that's all fun and well. But what usually happens, like usually maybe you are using AWS Athena and Redshift to do your analytics, and you're using the AWS marketplace, but maybe there's a data set in the Snowflake marketplace you want to use. So now you have to go move your data over to Snowflake, get access to that data set. Now, with a platform like Dremio that helps unify all that, you can connect to that where that data set you got from AWS's marketplace, you can connect to Snowflake and actually be able to work with all that data where it is, and basically save yourself the friction of having to figure out, hey, should I move it here from AWS to Snowflake or from Snowflake to AWS? Like, what is the right approach? You don't have to think about that. You just say, hey, here's my data. Here's how I want to model it. Let me go build my model.
Yeah, definitely. And it really seems that the added value to having these kind of tools in the company are we can really go deep into the metrics we're going to track through
Hmm.
time. We can really do custom ways, refresh them daily. We can really do advanced analytics, put models in production, and have like daily predictions in terms of the best leads to contact in the CRM, like things that maybe we can find in different vendors separately, but building in-house and putting them in production with like specific MLOps checks, so that we make sure, for example,
Hmm.
if we put in production some models that doesn't drift from the labels, the features, and so on. Uh, yeah, it really seems that this is something um, in marketing that will grow. I mean, this is my prediction, but that will like um, the field will become more data driven, even though marketing is a
Hmm.
pretty data driven field. But I'm super curious to ask you about, well, if you have some comments on that,
Hmm.
and also how do you approach content and marketing today from with all your expertise and background? Like, do you,
Hmm.
and even like for your personal content, when you learn new things, when you share videos, uh, do you have insights on how you approach marketing and
Yeah.
content in general?
Bottom line is far. Well, first, I'll just one final thought on your previous statement is that yeah, no, I think again the data lake house offers this sort of quickness of the access to the data. So when you're talking about like having like daily predictions and whatnot, the data lakehouse definitely makes it gives you a place, especially when you're using things like Kafka and Kafka Connect to kind of land the data. Like now you have the Iceberg Kafka Connect connector, and you can quickly land data. I actually just literally wrote a blog on that last Friday, and basically that allows you to kind of have that instantaneous access to data without that extra step, so that way you can actually be able to efficiently and timely produce those models that give you those like daily predictions. But on the content creation side, a couple things. I mean, the way I always created content is I just figure out, hey, what are my questions? Like, because generally, if I'm asking the question, chances are other people are asking the question. Like, what I see a lot when I read other people's content is that they assume a lot of prior knowledge, and I try not to, because what I want is I want someone who's maybe never touched data engineering, never even thought about data engineering, to be able to pick up one of my tutorials and be able to actually execute it from day end to end. So that means through while I write the tutorial, I'm oftentimes maybe restraining and re-explaining a lot of things people may be familiar with, but a lot of times people think they're familiar with something, but there's some nuance of it that they weren't aware of, or some. So I always try to like not take the knowledge of the reader for granted, and say, okay, let's not assume that they know X, Y, and Z, because again, people, especially practitioners, are oftentimes very specialized in the tools that they're using at that time. So oftentimes when they're exploring, there is room to fill in a lot of gaps. So I always try to take that approach, and again, a lot of the questions I'm asking, I find that are the questions that other people are asking. So then I don't just answer them and then write the steps to do the thing. I add those sort of nuances and like, okay, hey, you might want to consider this, or hey, here's a knob you might need to twist. Um, but that, and then as far as content creation goes, I'm a very big on hands-on. And again, hands-on, when I do hands-on tutorials, I like them to be something that you can do from scratch. The reason being is that like a lot of times you'll see tutorials that explain how you do something, but again, where it starts and where it ends, it's just kind of like explaining you the middle piece. It's like saying, hey, if you have a situation where you could do this, but oftentimes it's something's much more tangible, understandable if you can actually execute. So I'm very big on creating like unique Docker environments or containerized environments that people can kind of spin up on their laptop, where they can replicate things. So I have like tutorials on like Flink and Spark and Dremio that literally you can just read the blog, spin up the Docker environment that I provide, and you can actually hands-on ingest data into Iceberg with Flink, ingest data into Iceberg with Spark, or ingest data into Iceberg with Dremio, hands on, and not most recently with Kafka Connect. So I'm very big on that, and that tends to be really popular uh, because when people can do the whole thing, one, they feel like they learned a lot, and then they're more likely to share it if they feel like they learned a lot. It's not just the check off. Like I try not to be just to write something just to check off an SEO checkbox, where like, hey, the content's all right enough that it'll hit the search term. Like that's great, but then no one's going to share it if it doesn't really teach them what they came there to learn. Um, then so yeah, I think that's probably the most valuable thing. If you create quality content, like you create something that people something can take something away from, people will come. I see this a lot, especially on video, because talking has definitely been. I would say I was always a more verbal teacher before I was a more written teacher.
Mm-hmm.
So the video content does really well again because when I go over video, especially having the because when I was training people in finance and actually there was a period where I was training software developers too, there's a lot of times where I'm training people who are just switching careers and they might be like really early. Sometimes, like they chose to go this path versus, even completing high school, or they're, changing their career late in life, or there's a variety of different stories that they're coming at it. So I had to really, really, assume no prior knowledge. So I've just gotten used to always explain, like, as I do steps, why am I doing, not just what am I doing, but why am I doing it? And that's definitely been sort of effective in creating content that people come
Mm-hmm.
back to.
Awesome, amazing. And following up on the marketing side, so when I say marketing, do you like what KPIs or what comes to your mind in terms of key things to look as like you have strong experiences in marketing, so I don't know if you have
Mhm.
like key KPIs that really enjoy looking at, and maybe key tools, or like how do you approach marketing from a business perspective?
Um, yeah, I mean, I guess that strategically it depends on sort of like where in the funnel you're trying to optimize for. You can't optimize for everything, but you want to optimize for something. So you might be so as a company might be at a stage where they want to optimize the top of their funnel because that'll trickle down to the rest of the funnel. So in that case, you're thinking about like if you're like a SaaS service, you probably have like a free tier. So you might be trying to optimize like how many people are actively using your free tier. So this is generally kind of like the space that I operate in, where I'm trying to help people get hands on in
Hmm.
those initial stages. Um, but I mean, other efforts may be trying to optimize other layers of the funnel. So basically, maybe the top of you're happy with your top of funnel. You have this is great, but they're not at other stages of the sales cycle. They're not converting at the rate that you'd like. So then you have to think, okay, hey, sort of what basically gather data on sort of like, hey, what are the reasons that this step didn't move to this step, and then you create the content, and you create the support materials to help overcome the challenges you see there or create the practices there. But bottom line is, again, it depends on where in the pipeline you're optimizing for, and then its next step is just gathering information on sort of way the whys of the conversion, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. Like, hey,
Hmm.
conversations with deals that haven't gone through, conversation with deals that have gone through, with those sort of partners to kind of see what their thought process is, and then try to come up with some sort of framework to quantify it in a more structured way, so that
Hmm.
way you can then turn it into um, metrics that you can use to help better make decisions on that, or build it into some sort of framework that you
Hmm.
can use to help identify red flags and green flags, I guess.
Hmm.
Um, but it depends what you're optimizing for. So again, I generally operate more at top of funnel. So generally,
Hmm.
like me, it's more like, how can I make it easier for people to do the thing they're trying to do? So basically, the two things I have to do is, one, get to know people, be part of the community, so that way I know what they're trying to do and why they're trying to do it, and then help create the tools that they need, whether it's through blogs or supporting Python libraries or something like that, in order to enable them to do the things they're trying to do. And then basically that will, that has that effect, not only in changing their lives because they're doing what they wanted to do, but also again helping that top of funnel movement and getting people sort of hands on.
Awesome. Yeah, and coming back on your point before, LLMs are amazing to convert non-structured data to structured data or
Mhm.
semi-structured, and that's, yeah, I can really see like many ways to uh, get tons of value on that at any stage of the funnel, I guess. But following up, I would like to come back to something that we discussed previously and that we kept for now, which is query acceleration. So, I think I'm super curious to know about. So, so there are different table formats.
Mhm.
So, of course, Iceberg, Delta, Udi, just to name the three that came to mind
Mhm.
first. But like if you could give a brief introduction of what comes into like accelerating query, and then like
Mhm.
built-in tools that you have, and like why does it go faster, and like how does it leverage those stable formats.
Got it. Okay. Bottom line is when you think of like how can I run a query faster, there's essentially two ways. I either do less work, so the engine does less, and that makes it faster, or basically it does it with more power. So that means more processing power, and that means more expensive compute. So
Yeah.
usually you don't want to have to do that latter approach because that generally means more cost. So with a platform with tools like Iceberg and Dremio, generally the approach is trying to figure out how do you optimize that first layer. How can we do less work to accomplish the same query? Now, the first layer to kind of solving that, well, there's actually several layers. The first layer I would say is Parquet.
Okay.
So by storing your data in Parquet files, you have some levers that speed up your queries. So a little bit summary of like Apache Parquet files. Again, this is a binary format. So just by being binary, you're going to have some safe spacing versus over a text-based format like JSON and CSV. Two, and then also some compression benefits as well there. But secondhand, because it's columnar, that's going to allow you to have certain benefits when you're doing analytical queries, because oftentimes
Mm-hmm.
analytical queries don't need certain rows; they usually need all the rows, but only certain columns. So
Mm-hmm.
that's going to help. And then Parquet files, they break up those columns into row groups with metadata on those row groups. So an engine like Dremio, when it opens up the Parquet file, can then, instead of scanning all the rows and columns right away, it can look at that metadata and say, hey, does this particular group of rows actually have data that I care about? And if it doesn't, I can skip it, allowing me to scan that Parquet data set much quicker. That works really great for one file. But the problem is what happens when you have thousands of files that make up a singular data set?
Mm-hmm.
I could still skip row groups, but I'm still opening up each file. And this is where Apache Iceberg comes in. So the Apache Iceberg metadata or Delta Lake metadata or Hoodie metadata. Okay, now there's Apache Pymon, which is a Flink related format, but they provide like a metadata layer that the engine can then basically get those same types of statistics, but at a table level. So in this case, instead of just seeing those statistics for a row group, Apache Iceberg rolls up those statistics for like a whole file, and then rolls them up for a group of files, which is referred to as a manifest. Um, and based on that, now Dremio can say, hey, this whole manifest, this whole group of files, I don't even need to touch because it doesn't have values relevant to my query. So right there, you've made your query a lot faster. I could, depending on the query, I could take a million file table and only scan 1,000, which is an order of magnitudes faster. Then there's the optimizations that occur at the engine level. So each engine is going to be different. The engine that I know best is going to be Dremio, so I can speak to sort of like how Dremio accelerates. So the layers of acceleration there are one, how you once you read that data. So basically, I've went through Apache Iceberg's metadata. I've identified the files I need to scan. I've opened up those files, identified the row groups I need to scan, and now I scan those row groups. I have to load that data into memory. So using some sort of standard columnar format to load that data in memory is going to allow you to process a lot faster. And this is where Apache Arrow comes in. Because of the way Apache Arrow is designed, it makes that loading of data from Parquet into memory really, really efficient. And also with its Apache Arrow Flight protocol, it makes it easy to ship that data between nodes on a Dremio cluster and between clients much faster because you're shipping that data in a columnar format versus shipping it, through a row-based format like through a JDBC or ODBC.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to help. So you're processing the data faster because Apache Arrow is really built for fast processing, and you're moving that data around the different nodes in the cluster faster. So all of this is done before we even really done like any kind of materializations yet.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but oftentimes when you're operating on the data lake, the issue then becomes object storage. So in object storage, you have to go make an API request to S3 or ADLS to request all these objects. And you could possibly hit bottlenecks, or sometimes there's just so many requests it isn't able to accomplish them as fast as you'd like. So Dremio has something called the columnar cloud cache. So on those Dremio nodes, if it sees that you frequently access certain objects, it'll cache them on the Dremio nodes. So that way, and this accomplishes two things. One, it'll speed up the query because you're not waiting for those requests. But two, it actually reduces your cloud bill because you're not paying for all those data access requests, or not as many. So people actually have seen that significantly reduce their cloud bill. And then finally, the cherry on top is the data reflections feature in Dremio. So to really appreciate data reflections, you have to kind of see what everybody else does. So again, typically what you see everywhere else is materialized views and cubes. And then the problem with both of them is that they generally require the data engineer to make sure they maintain them, that they create new namespaces, so the analyst has to make sure they rewrite their queries. There's frictions that could result in mistakes. So if you're the data engineer and you built me a cube, but I forgot to update my query, I'm still going to have a slow query. So what Reflections does, it so and then this is a huge benefit because of Dremio's semantic layer. So Dremio has this inbuilt knowledge of knowing how your different data sets are related to each other. So I'll have a table and I might have a chain of views on top of it, and Dremio is aware of how all these relate to each other. So what happens with reflections, let's imagine I have table A. And then from table A, I've created view B. And from view B, I've created view C. What I can do is that maybe view C is where I'm creating a BI dashboard on top of. Well, if I want to speed that up, I can just turn on reflections with specifically a type called aggregate reflections. And just through a click of a button, I can specify which dimensions and measures I want to optimize for. And what it actually does under the hood is creates an Apache Iceberg table on your data lake that saves those pre-computed metrics. And then it will periodically update that table in the same way that the data engineer would manually do with a cube. But the cool thing is, let's say later on there's raw queries, so like not a BI dashboard. So we're just talking about raw rows that are occurring on B and C. And I noticed that they're generally always like basically let's pretend like it's voter data, and I know that these queries are always coming in by party. So they're searching, hey, give me all the voters for blue party, give me all the voters for red party, give me all the voters for yellow party. So what I can do is I can turn on a reflection in Dremio and say, hey, create a reflection on view B and partition it by party. Okay, and now if queries come in for B that are searching based on party, it'll take advantage of that reflection. Like the user doesn't even need to know it exists. Dremio will just automatically swap out and say, hey, instead of scanning the original table, I'm going to scan the reflection. But even better, if I scan C, and again, it's based on like party, Dremio knows that C is a child of B and B has a reflection, so it'll use that reflection to accelerate queries on C. So the base at the end of the day, you're getting more bang for your buck. So that same materialization can be used for a much wider variety of queries without the analyst really having to think about using it. It'll just work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's now the trick is knowing when to make them, and that's what we're working on. So like a recently released feature is reflection recommendations. So now Dremio will monitor the types of queries hitting your cluster and actually give you recommendations saying, hey, these are the recommendations that you will save you money and save you time. And in the
Mm-hmm.
future, we'll have autonomous reflections where it just kind of automatically happens.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. I love it. Thank you for your. It feels to me that I just scrolled on YouTube and clicked on a 5 minute summary of queries acceleration on different open source tables, and I had the best video ever. we
Thank
might
you.
clip we might clip all
Go
this
for it.
all this part. Um, I think so. You said many interesting things. I'd like to comment on the last point, which is I love how building metadata around all that will allow us to just pre-trigger custom optimizations on the go without the end user thinking about it. And so it reduces it augments what the user needs without any engineering interventions or consideration, and that will be super helpful in terms of costs. And I think this is one of the most competitive advantages that key platforms are building, from my understanding. Like, how do you optimize costs using and leveraging all this data and enhancing all these techniques? Maybe you'd like to comment on that, but my follow-up question on this is scaling. So
Mhm.
you have a lot of side projects or projects that you build to understand better the concepts and so on, but it always strikes me how different it is to like play around with a tool and like doing something with it, and like really pushing the tools on a lot of data and seeing how it reacts and understanding other concepts. So what's your view on scaling data and like learning learning to scale systems and mastering the concepts with the approach that you shared before?
I would say the first thing I would ask when it comes to scaling for any so this require independent of any tool or system that you're using is always questioning, what are you doing and whether you need to do it at that scale. Because I think a lot of times a lot of people find themselves needing more compute power, more storage, more scale, and oftentimes it's uh, sometimes it comes from a lack of sort of like questioning, hey, do I really need to store all this data? Okay, like does this query really need to be accomplished like this fast?
Mm,
And then so oftentimes I would say, hey, like the first layer to really helping sort of solve especially cost issues that are related to scaling is asking yourself sort of like, hey, what are my priorities, and is really everything a priority?
mhm,
But when it comes to handling scale and minimizing cost, I can and again, this is more because I'm just very familiar with Dremio. I can really speak to how Dremio can help there. And we do have some documents that we've recently released on specifically on that. Like I think we just released a white paper that goes over actual customer scenarios where people offloaded some of their Snowflake workloads into Dremio, and we're actually reduced their costs up to like 90%. And again, not there's examples that are like 50%. So again, it depends on the particular use case. So it's not like, hey, all my costs are gone, but there's a pretty compelling story for that. I would say in most situations it'll reduce your cost
uh-huh,
somewhat.
uh-huh,
But how does it do that? Okay, and how does it give you more scale? So I'll give you a couple different scenarios.
mhm,
Um, so for example, I might have a going back to the BI dashboard example because I just think that's like it's just a fairly clear cut scenario. So let's say I have like a data set that I build a BI dashboard off of in Snowflake. What I can do, the problem is that every time someone accesses that BI dashboard, typically that's going to mean a query being sent to Snowflake Compute for that specific dashboard. Okay, so I may have been really happy with Snowflake to get to that point, but what I can do to reduce costs is I could connect to Dremio because Dremio can connect to Snowflake. Then what I do is I serve the dashboard from Dremio. Now, if I just do that, again, technically I haven't changed anything initially. What changes things is that you turn on reflections. So I would reflect that data set because then what happens now, anytime a query comes in, Dremio doesn't push down the Snowflake. Dremio will instead go to your data lake to scan the reflection. And then now, in that case, you're now using a much cheaper compute to serve that same dashboard that you may have been happy to curate on Snowflake, but you've minimized your essentially your incremental cost. At the same time, now when it comes to scale, good examples like SQL Server or like a lot of database systems where there's very limited horizontal scaling versus like you can do vertical scaling, you can keep getting a bigger and bigger machine, but there comes a point where you can't get a bigger database or it becomes cost prohibitive to get a bigger, more powerful uh, thing. So what some people will do is that they may have like a SQL server. What they do is they connect it to Dremio, and what they can do is that they'll reflect the tables that are most frequently hit. So now
mhm,
what happens when the queries go to Dremio, instead of it being a dish being pushed onto a SQL server, it's going to go to the materializations on their data lake, and that
mhm,
means they don't have to necessarily go get a second SQL server, or the point at which they have to spend the money to scale up to the next size becomes a lot farther,
mhm,
because you can scale the data lake as much as you want, because when Dremio's querying the data lake itself, the data lake is infinitely scalable, the storage layer, and then the compute layer, Dremio's compute layer, since it's separate, is infinitely scalable. So in that case, the scaling issue doesn't become an issue anymore. So you don't have to necessarily shard your data across multiple databases. It can still be sitting in one database, and using Dremio's reflections, you can make that scalable at size. So really, it's the
mm.
reflections feature that really allows virtualization at scale.
All right. It really seems to me like hard to master those concepts when we're not playing with the technology itself. Do you agree?
Yeah, no, I mean a lot of these things are just realizations I had when I talked to different people. Like a lot of like for example, like that SQL Server one that never was apparent to me until like literally I was talking to a Dremio customer who's like,
Yeah.
yeah, no, this was a great use case for us, and I'm like, oh, that's actually like, that's a really interesting way to use it. Or that previous like Git for data one with the financial company, like, oh, I'm familiar with the technology, but like the actual like, hey, using it this way wasn't apparent. And then like And then again, going more to like that fundamental point, like really appreciating what a lot of these things are doing is hard to do until you've gone hands on. And this is
Yeah,
why I try the right content that makes it easy to get hands on. So that way it's much easier to appreciate these finer points.
I see. Yeah, and like having the core concepts at a small scale, even that is sufficient to master the concepts when we talk about terabyte, petabytes of data. Got it.
Exactly. Because, yeah.
Yeah, please. Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say, just like yeah, basically, once you understand that the concept at a foundational level, it becomes a much easier to start, leveraging that
Yeah.
in bigger and bigger use cases. So yeah, it's just getting that initial aha moment.
This is important. I love it. Okay, maybe this is my last question before doing the closing round. So I would like to ask you about open source.
Hmm.
You've been participating for some time now on the open source community, connecting with a lot of people. You mentioned before Deepankar. We have an episode on the podcast, so feel free to check out these episodes. Um, my question to you around open source is, how would you tell people to get involved into the open source community? What are the benefits? And you kind of shared at the beginning what most excites you about open source, but maybe like what would you be looking at if you were starting? I think that could be very useful.
I mean, if you're interested in like, I think a mistake people make is that they feel to participate in open source means they must contribute to the project. Like at the end of the day, like if you have something to contribute to the project, contribute it. Like in the sense, like you see a way that it can be done better, then go make that pull request. But you don't have to go out of your way to find those things to be a good community member. Good places where you can participate in the community that's really helpful is like one docs. Okay, a lot of open source projects could always use a lot of help on the docs. Okay, because like you have a lot of people building the thing, but not a lot of oftentimes as many people thinking about okay, how can we really provide sufficient documentation for people to use the thing. So docs are a really good low hanging fruit. Also, just helping, also being sort of like volunteer tech support. Okay, like just being like, for example, if you really are passionate about Apache Iceberg, hanging out on the Apache Iceberg Slack or looking on Stack Overflow for Apache Iceberg questions, or looking at Apache Iceberg issues on the repo and helping people overcome sort of challenges they're having that are not necessarily bugs, but are maybe whatnot, and also creating content around it. So, like for example, like far as contributions I've made to like specifically the Apache Iceberg community has mainly been around content and helping people understand Apache Iceberg and how it works and how it's engineered and all this kind of stuff. Um, and then also a, a, some very minor doc contributions, but hopefully more in the future. But basically through like a lot of the blogs that help people get hands on with Iceberg, that helps adoption of the open source project. So being part of the community, there's lots of layers to doing that. Whether it's being, a source of support,
Hmm.
an advocate of the project, um, or and then again being code contributors to the project. But what I would avoid is going looking for open source projects to contribute to for the sake of making a contribution, where you basically you're kind of forcing yourself to try to contribute code that may or may not be helpful to the project. Like if you have like a clear idea, like hey, I think this will make this project better, you validate it, go for it.
Right.
But I think like a lot of times people get told like, oh, you're a new developer, go contribute to open source, and
Right.
then they just start making random pull requests to random projects.
Right, you're better off doing your technique of just building small tutorials on mastering the concepts, and while you're doing that, you'll have a better understanding of the frameworks and like the similarities between the different open source projects. And then once you get your hands on, you'll have clear ideas of what you can participate with. And in the meanwhile, you can
Hmm.
always read and document, and that's a super useful way to master concepts and make sure you understand them clearly and have feedback. This is amazing with the open source community. It's that you can access feedback. You can confront reality. Where a lot of time when we do
Yes.
projects, well, no one is going to tell us that sucks or we're missing the point or whatever. In open source, there are people who might tell you that you failed earlier and you wouldn't lose that much time into a side project or anything. Amazing. So two last questions, I think. And first of all, thank you very much for coming on the show and sharing. If you're still here, that means a lot to us. So feel free to drop a comment, ask any questions, and review on any platform of your choice. That's really helpful. Where can people learn more about your content? So LinkedIn, do you have a website? Where can they
Oh
find
yeah.
the
Basically, if people want to kind of learn more, I have a couple different outlets. First off, I just would invite people to head over to dremio.com/blog. Most of the blogs I'm going to put out in the database are going to be located there. I do have like a Substack, a LinkedIn, and Medium blog. They all share the same articles, so just whichever platform you prefer. Those are going to be some additional blogs that I'll do on data and tech in general. Um, but you can find all of that by going to bio.alexmerced.com/data. That'll have a link to all my sort of data specific sources. But I also do a lot of content on web development, which you can find um, bio.alexmerced.com/web. So I'll make sure to provide both links for the notes. But bottom line, I'm pretty easy to find, or you can just go to alexmerced.com and find. But I highly recommend, a good place to start is just check out any of my recent blogs. That usually they're titled like database to dashboard. So like there's one for like MySQL, there's one for Postgres, one for MongoDB, one for Apache Druid, and one for SQL Server. And all of these will allow you to create a full data lakehouse environment on your laptop. You'll take that database, ingest data from that database into Iceberg, and then serve a dashboard with it. And this will give you sort of a really end-to-end experience, seeing what basically one how easy it is, this sort of architecture, but really kind of see the value of that architecture, and also you'll learn a lot in the process.
amazing? Amazing, that's super useful. And last question, would you have a message for the Let's Talk AI community? It can be anything we discussed in the show, or it can be something not related, you decide.
Overall, I would just say like just keep being curious. Like honestly, like whatever is your goal, whatever is your mission, like if you approach it with passion, and again, the as you can tell from my backstory, like the direction to get anywhere isn't necessarily a straight line. Sometimes it's so don't take if the road gives you detours or you end up in different paths. Don't think that it's not going to get you to where you're eventually going to, because everything you do will have its lessons if you're looking to learn those lessons. And if you try to approach anything you do with the approach of wanting to create value, you'll always find that it's going to lead to great things. Like at the end of the day, like if you are always just seeking to provide value to others, people are going to want you around. People are going to give you opportunities because who doesn't want someone who produces value around? So just focus on that. Focus on just being excited about doing whatever you're doing, providing as much value as you can, and being curious as you can. And amazing things will happen. And a great way to satisfy that curiosity is by continuing to listen to LTAI.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much, Alex, for your time. I had an amazing time, and I wish you to have an amazing day.
Thank you very much. It's been great.